It is absolutely a pleasure to introduce Heidi Wastweet, who's going to speak to us. Now, I just want you to note what's in the background behind my head. This is the great medal that Heidi did for us in 2020. This is the club's medal. And I think you will all agree this is great work. Heidi basically is a sculptor and an artist of the first uh, class. She specializes in bas relief sculpture and has produced over 1,000 coins and medals since 1987. She is the president of the American Medallic Sculpture Association. She's past member of the Citizen Coinage Advisory Committee at the U.S. Mint and a current member of the Artistic Infusion Program, both set up by the U.S. Mint. I mean, she was chief engraver for the Sunshine Mint for over 11 years, and she was basically the global the lead designer and sculptor for the Global Mint, and now she, I think, works as an independent. And with that, I'm gonna let Heidi talk to us about old water, new water, drawing modern inspiration from classic metals.
The talk today is called Old Well, New Water. And what I'm going to do today is take you in a deep dive into the creative process. And we're really looking at the aesthetics rather than the history. So we're focusing on that. And I want to talk about how ancient metals, classic metals, how they're still relevant, how they're connected to modern metals, and how they inspire my work specifically. And we're going to do some deep dives into that. I'm going to talk about the Raven Steals the Sun later on in the presentation, so we'll get there. But I'm going to make you wait a little bit for that. And the reason that I want to talk about this is there's an ongoing debate that I've heard a lot from collectors and talking to them over the years, where there's some who really prefer classic old metals and some who really prefer modern metals and wish that we would just stop doing old metals. But I want to bridge that. I don't think those are opposing opinions, and they can go together quite well. And so we're going to look at how that works. So first, I'm going to break down the time frame of creating. One of the most common questions I get is, how long does it take you to make a medal? Like Gamal said, I've done over 1,000 medals over my career. Some of them are very fast, some of them are very slow. It's really impossible to say how long something takes or to predict how long it will take, because it's not a linear process. I'm thinking about this while I'm driving the car. I'm reading, I'm researching, and you might be surprised to learn that on average, a full quarter of my time is spent in research. That's reading about the history of the subject, researching images and inspiration. And that's the quarter that we're going to focus on today. Once I have that research together, that's when the designing happens and I put it all together. And then half of that is what I consider the fun part, which is the sculpting. So research, we can break that into two parts: the investigation and the gathering of resources, and then further divide that into two categories. We have the visual ingredients and then the artistic inspiration. So the visual ingredients might be, in the case of the Raven Steals the Sun, pictures and photographs of ravens, research into clouds, which I use in here, the Native American designs. And then the inspiration part of that, I'm reading the Native American mythology about the raven. We'll talk a little more about that later. Then the designing puts it all together. And there's two parts to designing that we won't get too much into today, but a little bit. We're doing the sketching, which is getting the pencil to the paper, getting some ideas out. I start with little tiny thumbnail drawings to get my composition. And then I'm integrating in the computer to put everything together, to size it. And I do a lot of lettering on the computer. So let's look down in that well of inspiration and see what's there when we talk about classic metals. Up in the left-hand corner, you can see the classic Bisanello. This is, as many of you know, credited to be the first of the art metals, which were non-monetary, just for the aesthetics themselves, and maybe to commemorate a person, but really focused on just being a piece of art. So even though that is the first, it's still a benchmark. Pisanello's work is very inspirational to me. In the middle, we see Laura Garden Fraser with some very delicate lines and sensitivity to her sculpting. And then, of course, the classic Albert Weinman. I have thousands of these pictures stored on my computer. In fact, I'm a bit of a hoarder when it comes to images. And I just grab whatever appeals to me, whatever aesthetic is going to give me an idea, a spark of, oh, I can take that, I can tweak that into something else, something new, rather than an imitation. Down in the lower right-hand corner, you can see a classic Lydian coin, which are the first coins in metal, according to historians. And when I was younger, I saw these as rather crude and primitive, but the more I learn and the more I work, the more I realize that they are not crude or primitive at all. In fact, they're genius, and they inspire me endlessly. And I pull a lot from them as far as clarity of image and message and the freeness of the composition. And then we cannot talk about classic metals and inspiration, of course, without talking about St. Gaudens. He is our benchmark of metal design in this country and American metals. And even though he's not with us, obviously, I still consider him a teacher. It's someone I go to again and again to study his lines, his forms, and his compositions, and how he represents life without being, by still having artistic license and still representing real life without being photographic in his representation. That's really inspiring to me. And then we can see here, I have a circle of ancient coins coming to the future, and there's this repeating of, the toga drapery and the laurel wreaths. And for hundreds of years, these common themes come up again and again. And some people ask me, why can't we just keep doing that? How many times can we repeat the same thing? I strive to be of my own era and of my own style. So while these represent a deep well of inspiration, I want to pull away from that and do something new. So why do I want to do something new? Because it can't be done better. The masters are the masters. I can't compete with that. I can only be myself. Otherwise, it's just imitation. To be authentic as an artist, I have to be myself. The best advice my dad ever gave me, he said, if you try to be like someone else, the very best you could ever hope to be is second. But if you're yourself, you're always the best at it. And I think about that often. So wait, what is modern anyway? What do I mean by modern? As I talk to people over the years, I realize there's no consensus on what comes to mind when we say the word modern. Is modern Jackson Pollock and Picasso, like the modernist art movement? Or is modern fashion or the technology we use today? Is that what we mean by modern? So I want to break that down into the most simple definition of modern is just simply not imitating the past. So we're not trying to be any style when we say modern, we're just saying new. So now let's do a deep dive into a specific example for the Elizabethan Club at Yale University. This was brought to me by one of your own members, Dr. Stephen Scher, and he asked me to come in and make a medal for the club that would be presented to people who were dedicated to the service to the club and to honor their distinguished service. So I went to the club to gather my resources and my inspirations. So I put together here a few things that I gathered there. You see on the left-hand side of your screen is the Tudor Badge. This was the badge of Anne Boleyn, who was the second doomed wife of Henry VIII. And she passed this down to her daughter, who was the future Queen Elizabeth. In the middle, in the background, you see a letter. This is hand signed by Queen Elizabeth herself. This is an artifact that is in the club. It's on their wall. And I was really drawn to the beautiful hand lettering of this. And then on the right-hand side of the screen, you'll see the vault. So the club is known for its astounding collection of rare old books, just invaluable collection. And they keep it in this wonderful vault that they only open up at certain times of the day and certain times of the week. And I thought, what invites more curiosity than a locked vault? So I really love the design of the mechanics of this door. Also at the club, they have their very own tea. It's their own blend of black tea, and they have their own china. And every afternoon, they have a social event around this tea. And going into this program, I had a little bit of a preconceived notion of this old school university setting as quite serious, but they're not. They had a quite levity in the air and very sharp wit and very jovial. And there were lots of little items around the club that had a good sense of humor. And so I wanted to tie that into it also. So once I gather those ingredients together, now I'm looking for inspiration of how to then turn this into something visual. So these are some of the coins that I've pulled out. At the top, you can see the classic laurel leaf. So this medal is going to have a space in it for the recipient's name to be engraved. So that needs to have a space in the middle that's clear. And so I want to play on that classic idea. Up in the right-hand corner at the very top, there's the Tudor rose, which is part of that badge that I showed you earlier. So I'm going to use that. Up in the left-hand corner, I love this piece, and there's some that are similar too that have this background pattern. So instead of the portrait just being on a flat background, you've got some interesting like wallpaper type stuff going on behind her. The classic Indian head here I go to again and again because I love the creativity of infusing this, and the look of that really inspires me on many projects. So the resulting of this is this sketch. This is my pattern then for the medal. So you can notice here that this falcon is holding the cup of tea. So that's where I infuse humor into it, to keep that sense of wit about it and to keep it grounded to the club itself. In the background, I took that letter that Queen Elizabeth had signed, and rather than try to copy that style of writing, I literally just traced it to have the most authenticity to those forms. And then I did quite a bit of research and reading to try to figure out what kind of bird was on the badge. There was some debate about that. And I came to the conclusion that this was a gerfalcon, which is the fastest bird on the planet. And at the time of Queen Elizabeth, only aristocracy was allowed to own these birds as their falconing companions. So I got photographs of the birds themselves and based my sculpture as authentic as I can on that particular bird. The Tudor rose is coming out of the dead stump, is representing the hope for her, to Anne Boleyn to have children into the royal family. On the right-hand side, we see the reverse of the medal. So the form of this is still that wreath that we saw earlier, but on the side with names for the recipient. So here I want to give breakdown of that so you can see side by side. Here is the original logo that the club uses. You can see I've copied and stayed true to the exact form of that, but then updated it with my own style. And here's where that background gave me the idea to put the lettering behind the falcon, the cup of tea itself. And here's that Tudor rose. And then here, you can't see it yet, but on the wings here, I'm going to incuse them the way the Indian is. The crown comes from this piece here, and also her initials over here. So this is the cipher of Queen Elizabeth, and of course the vault and the wreath. So the results of that look like this. So here you can see the lettering from the handwritten letter are incused to give them maximum amount of layering and depth. Coins, of course, don't give you a lot of relief, so I have to use a lot of illusion to give the most depth and contrast to the images. And then you can see the way the wings cut into the background, they incuse like the Indian head. And on the mechanic side, I've also incused the lettering. So I have, when the patina is applied to the metal, then that becomes black. So that's something also I have to anticipate when I'm designing, when I'm sculpting, is will the metal have patina on it? How will the patina affect the design? And that's all I can do is predict. I never know for sure because that's out of my hands. But over the years, I've gotten pretty good at visualizing how it will be. So the next project I want to show you is for Brook Green Gardens. You may be familiar with this series. It's a long-running series. It's a who's who of some really fantastic sculptors that are all a hard act to follow. This is the 45th, I think, in the series that I was assigned to do. And there was a lot of pressure I felt on myself to live up to all those sculptors. And after some thinking, I decided for my subject that I would choose this black crowned night heron. They have quite a population there on the grounds of Brook Green Gardens in South Carolina, and they have a lot of character. And I would sit with them and take photographs of them. And each bird had its own kind of attitude. And I wanted to portray that on the coin. Some were quite playful, some were very serious and grumpy. So my inspiration in this project were the coins in the series itself. So I pulled out some of my favorite pieces to look at it again and again. The Lathrop piece on the left, I really like the lines of this piece and how it just has a simple central image. It's clear and straightforward. It's not cluttered. And it's lighthearted also. The John Cook medal, of course, again, we have this push and pull of the surface, which I love. And it adds depth and interest, and it takes the patina very nicely. The Marshall Fredericks piece, again, on the reverse, we have a different kind of surface where it's not just a flat background. Those leaves overlapping really create a lot of depth and take you out of the plane of the surface. And the Casanova also does the same thing. So these are very inspiring to me. And I then have to bring all of these pieces together into a design. And if you see at the upper left-hand corner, the very, very rough little sketches where I'm just thinking about the composition. I'm thinking about, and this is not scientific at all, but just a gut feeling, how the shapes work together. And then I'm doing many trials of how my photographs can become designs, how they flow. And in this case, I'm also doing some clay maquettes and settling on the bottom right-hand side. This is pretty much my final composition here. And this is the resulting metal. So you can see how the push and pull of the background, not just putting the birds on a flat background, but going into the surface, creating an atmosphere is really evident here. The bird on the left is very playful and goofy, where the one on the right, on the reverse side, is very stoic and serious and have the suggestion of a sun or a moon behind it. And the branches go from raised relief into incuse. Now for our guest of honor piece, the Raven Steals the Sun medal, which we talked about earlier for the Medal Collectors of America. Here I have some inspiration pieces, which were the pieces that came before me. The earliest one from Alex Shagan, and then last year's from my dear friend Eugene Daub. Now, the beginning of this project, I worked with Ira Rizak, and we talked about what would be an appropriate topic. And between the two of us, I talked to him about doing a raven, because what first came to mind is I want to represent this nature of collecting without being too literal. And I remembered hearing that ravens are drawn to shiny things and they collect them and bring them back to their nest. Then in my research, I found that that wasn't exactly true when it came to wild birds, but it led me to the next topic, which was the raven steals the sun, because in your series, Ira suggested that we stick with an Native American connection. So that tied in perfectly. The Raven Steals the Sun is a great mythology. It's a story that's passed down generations in many tribes across the country and even into Canada. And the story is that the raven, who's very clever, mischievous, finds out that the sun is hidden in a box and it's protected by a human, but the world is dark. So the raven, and the story varies, depending on who tells it, but the basic premise is that the raven is clever and he gets his way in and he steals the sun out of the box, lifts it up into the sky, creates the sun and the stars, and lights the earth, which is just a fantastic story. But I have no idea how to portray this. This is one of those times when I just ran up against a wall of just writer's block, artist block. I have nothing. Sometimes this happens. Sometimes an idea comes to me right away, and sometimes just banging my head against the wall. I don't know how to do this. And one of the challenges here is I'm not Native American. I don't want to pretend to be Native American, but I don't want to ignore the origins of the story either. So how do I portray the Native Americans, stay authentic to myself at the same time? This is what I struggled with, down to authenticity. So I thought, well, I'll focus on the sun part of it, since that's the center to the story. If you see in the upper left-hand side of your screen, when we're children, it seems we all gravitate to the same simple representation of a sun. It's a circle with lines radiating out of it. It's not realistic at all, but somehow we all have the same idea of what a sun looks like. And even if you look at the old master medals, Donald DeLue and St. Gaudens, etc., they basically have the same thing. It's a ball with lines coming out of it, which I think is really charming because it's something that we carry with us since we're children. But I want to push that over the top. I want to make those lines go in and out of the surface and bounce light and take that idea, but then a step further. So I finally come up with this tiny little thumbnail sketch that doesn't look like much, but it's the raven flying up into the sky after he's put the sun up there, and the sun is overwhelmingly spreading its light across the dark universe. And then the clouds, because this is a fantastical story, I want to keep them also fantastical clouds, not too overly realistic. Now here are some old medals that I pulled as inspiration for how to make this all come together. So it's on the upper left, you can see these are some clouds that are very stylized that I found were really charming. And then I want to talk about lettering for a second. The classic position of lettering is, of course, running around the curve of the metal. You see that all the time. That's classic. And because your organization is such a classic organization, I wanted to keep some of that traditional feel of the metal. So on the reverse, you'll notice that the lettering goes very traditional around the edge. And then we see some ancient Greek coins. Now, a lot of you have looked at these also, and you see that on the back they have an incuse kind of stamp look to it. And I always thought this was charming. And in thinking about the raven stealing the sun out of the box, I didn't want to do a box. I didn't want to literally a box, but represent a box feeling. And so this is what came to mind, is those old Greek coins that I could, and that was my solution. And also, if you look at the lower left, a lot of Asian coins have this square hole in the middle. And I thought that was a good representation for a box. I also love the Haida style or ovoid design of the Native Americans, but this is a whole art in itself. It's not something that I know how to do, and I don't want to pretend to know how to do. So I based my design on a piece of antiquity so that I could have that authenticity back in the design. So here's my original drawing for that. You can see the sun in the box, the way those old Greeks were. And here's the breakdown. So here's some, Haida, of course, is a two-dimensional art form, and you often using black and red, but we need to now make that into three-dimensional. So this British Columbia coin showed me how that Haida can be three-dimensional. So that was inspiring. Here's how the box inspired the box on the coin where the sun is hidden. And here's how the clouds relate to the clouds that I drew. And of course, the classic sun with the rays coming out, but I've made many more rays, and instead of just literal straight lines, a more undulating feel. And the antiquity box that I use for the background. These are the plasters. So here, like I was talking earlier, we have to predict what the patina is going to do on the finished piece. These white plasters have a different feel, a different look to them, which have their own charm, and I really love them too. And here, of course, is the finished metal. And you can see now how the patina enhances the box because it's cut down in. It's going to catch more of the patina in it. It's going to be a darker space. And then the sun being highlight is going to be brighter. And then I was hoping, and I think it achieved, the raven would be on the, the patina would highlight the bird on top of that shallow Haida design. And I wanted the bird to have a lot of animation, and again, bring in a little bit of humor, the way he seems so delighted in stealing the sun out of the box and his claws grabbing it. So the sun with all the rays, this was actually really time consuming to do, and I'd never done anything like this before on a deep relief, to try to get it to go and bend around the bird, but still keep the line straight, and not knowing exactly how the patina was going to catch. I really wasn't sure how this was going to turn out, but in the end, I'm really pleased with how it turned out. So, not so you think that I only do birds. It was really just a pure coincidence that those three metals were all birds. I have no particular specialty of birds. They just happen to come up time and time again. I do love birds. But when we talk about classical metals, what's more classical than a liberty head? Beauty never gets old, but our ideas of beauty change over the generations. So that gets updated. The piece on the left it reads, "The Grand Duchess of Marksova, Lorelei Ann." So this was a portrait of my client's wife, Gary Marks, his wife, Laura. And he wanted to make this feel like an old coin of a country with a queen or a duchess and have a real royal feel to it. So of course, I went back into the antiquities to see what that was like. On the reverse of the classic medal, I liked the way it was cut into quarters. So I used that. And because she's not an actual queen, I just suggested the crown on her head. And she had a particular affection for these butterflies. So I put the butterfly there. And he had taken some secret snapshots of her, which I used for the portrait. And then he surprised her with this medal. Marksova is based on his last name, Marks. So it's not a real country. But some people that may pick up this coin and not know, they meant, where's Marksova? I've never heard of that. But it was a really fun project, and I like how it turned out. And then sadly, Lori died just this last November. So this has extra special meaning to me that I was able to make this for her when she was alive. On the right is the classic Queen Elizabeth. This was for a project, which was a Norse mythology project. So I was looking to the Stave churches in Norway for their carvings, which are really wonderful, and how to pull that in and match it with the classic portrait of the Queen, but make it feel new. So I've taken the lettering and flipped it over onto just one side, which is a little unexpected, and then have the Norwegian design on the other half. So here are some Liberty heads. Across the top, you can see some ancient pieces that inspire me. And then on the lower left, this medal is called Freedom Girl. This is by far the most volume of any coin that I've struck. There has to be over 100,000 of these that have been struck by now. She's very popular. And I can't predict as an artist what's going to be popular or not, but this one just really, for some reason, hits a note with people. And I get letters from people telling me how much they like this. People can't get enough of this, which is what I'm here for. It's fantastic. On the right is a gold piece. This is very rare. This company wasn't in business for very long. It was a beautiful coin, but they didn't make very many, and they're hard to find. So if anyone has one, you're lucky. I don't have one of these. But what was fun here is I wanted to portray a little different pose, a little different, more modern face. And then her crown is less literal in that it just freely drops back off of her face. Here's another example. And you may remember this medal from earlier. This was one of the inspirations for the Elizabethan Club. And I pulled it again here for inspiration on this little Liberty head. And I chose to give her oak leaves in the background. This was for a company in Oakland, California. So I wanted to pull in the oak reference. And then her face is pretty classic, but to push this just to a little different modern edge, you'll notice that her drapery, her clothing, is just a flat graphic surface. There's no shape to it. It's very bold. And I like the marriage of those two aspects, the classic and the modern. So all of the medals we've talked about so far have been struck medals. So the last piece I want to show you is a cast medal. So this was something I did for myself, not for a client, based on the photographer, Edward Muybridge. If you're familiar with him, he set about his camera with some automatic triggers. And it had been a debate in history whether when a horse ran, did all of the hooves come off the ground at the same time, or was there always one hoof touching the ground? And he finally proved that yes, all four hooves come off the ground at one time, thanks to his photography. And he also developed this Zoprasca lantern, which would animate the photographs that he took. So I based the medal on one of his original Zoprasca discs. And I wanted to know, could I have an animated medal? So if you see on the obverse, the design in the background, that's the crosshairs of his actual camera lens. And in the middle of that is a raised dot. And when you lay this medal on a flat surface, it'll spin because of that raised dot on the center point. And so you'll see the horses spinning in the background. A friend of mine put together a video. She used a strobe light and a turntable so that you can actually see. It's hard to see with your naked eye. When it's spinning, you really need the strobe. But here, I'll play this for you. There it is. You can see the horses jumping in the strobe light. So now we have an animated medal. So sometimes modern isn't how it looks. It's not the aesthetics. It's the function, the originality, the innovation that makes it modern. This is a really fun medal. So that is the conclusion of the presentation. Oops, get my screen. There we are. So here are some of the medals we talked about today. And Gamal said he would take some questions if there are any.
What do you think of vacant space on medals?
Oh, I'm a big fan of vacant space. In the advertising world, you may have heard the term white space. The same applies to medals. And because they're small, there's a tendency to try to cram a lot in there to make everything big and all the way to the corners. But that intuition is actually the opposite of what makes a coin clear and visible. If you look back at those ancient Greek coins, they were masters of clarity, even though they were very small. And if you don't have your reading glasses on like me, you can still see exactly what's on those coins because they were so bold. And a lot of that has to do with white space and clarity of line. So I'm a fan of trying to pull in at least some space. Like if you see on this slide right here, for the falcon on the left, the area behind his wing, there's a lot of textures and layers in this piece, but I was very purposeful in making that area very smooth. It gives the eye a place to rest. And in the raven piece, the area around the sun within the box is the smooth eye rest place. And on the reverse, the sun itself is a very, very smooth texture to contrast with all the energy going on around it. And then in the Brook green piece, you can see the sun, again, is this very smooth and restful place to contrast the heavy texture of the feathers. So.
I have a question here. Says, have you submitted any designs to the Mint, US Mint yet?
I have. As in the introduction, Gamal stated that I'm working now with the AIP program. I'm not at liberty yet to talk about any of the programs that I'm working on. That's still in the background, but in the future, they will be public facing and I'll be able to talk about those.
What are you working on in the future?
In the future, I'm going to continue to do a lot of what I've been doing. I'm just focusing on improving quality and pushing myself beyond the limits into new creative territory. I'm also working on some larger pieces. After working very small on metals, it's very freeing to work on monumental size pieces. So I've got some of that going. And then, of course, designing with the Mint is a new avenue where I'm not sculpting, I'm only designing. So that's really getting me back into the joy of just drawing.
Do you have a favorite medal that you've created?
Yeah, I get this question quite a bit. It's like asking which of your children you like best.
What I was going to say.
Yeah.
You have a favorite son?
Right. I do have medals that I maybe wish I could go back and fix. And I have some that I like more than others. There's not one that jumps out as a favorite. Obviously, the ones that I picked for the presentation today are ones that I'm particularly fond of.
Do you distinguish obverse and reverse? And if so, how?
Great question. So in the numismatic world, it's typical to have, say, a portrait on the obverse and a wreath on the reverse. And beyond tradition, there's actually a technical reason for that. Because of the way metal moves when you strike a coin, the face on the obverse takes a lot of volume of metal, and then you have the wreath on the reverse. So if you see my face here and my hands, it's both sides of the metal at the same time. You have the wreath around the head, and that helps move the metal. So those old masters were really brilliant. They weren't just looking at the aesthetics of it, but the functionality of it. And those old Greek coins that we talked about, where the reverse, it has a punch feel to it, that also helps to fill the metal. So that's where form follows function. And that's where the tradition came from, of the head on the front. Also, there's a feeling of this main topic on the obverse and the supporting on the reverse. There's also a wonderful thing about metals that you can portray time, which you can't do with a painting or a traditional statue so much. But on a metal, you can portray a time of events. It can be future, past on the back, future on the front, or present and past, or what happened before, what happened after, or contrasting ideas. So that's one way to play up both sides. And in today's world also, because we see so much on the computer and in print too, when you see metals portrayed this way, you see obverse and reverse side by side. So I've begun designing them to not only work in the hand, but also on the screen, so that maybe sometimes there's a continuation of a design from obverse to reverse that you only see when it's portrayed side by side on your computer or in print. But I do put thought into the reverse looking like a reverse and the obverse looking like an obverse, even though it's not always obvious.
Are you sensitive in the design process to the technical aspects of striking the metal?
Very much so. So my first 11 years in this industry was spent at Sunshine Mint. I was the first female back in the shop. There was 11 guys and me, and they didn't know what to do with me. So I started, I don't know if anyone knows Don Dow. He has since passed, but he got me started into this. He was a medalist, and he taught me the basics, and then he soon left the company. So I was on my own. And I was not only designing and sculpting, I was also running the engraving machines that cut the dies. These were old Augenstein. We didn't have Janviers, but we had Augensteins and Mint Master machines that I cut dies on. So I had my hands in the grease. I worked in the die shop. I did the heat treating of the metals. I did polishing of dies, and would sit with the press operators. And so if they had trouble filling a coin, maybe I would have to go back and fix something on the coin. So I was very sensitive to how the metal filled. If you have like one center point, like in a portrait, if you have just one nose facing forward that's deeper, it's really hard to fill that no matter how shallow the coin. So I learned by working in the shop itself, I became very sensitive to what I put on paper, how that affects everything down the line and what everyone else does in the mint. Mm-hmm. And that's really a benefit now that I'm really lucky to have that background, that education, so that I can be sensitive to that, and I can help my clients feel confident that their metals will fill and they'll be technically producible in the end.
I think that's a very good background to help you understand how it works.
Yeah, I'm really lucky in that Sunshine Mint now is a very, very large company. They have over 100 employees. So to be in the beginning, just one of 11 or 12 of us, it gave me the space to roam around the entire operation, because everything wasn't as specialized then. And Marvin Ott was the owner of the company, and he was like a second father to me, and really gave me a lot of space to learn and to make mistakes. And he was very understanding in that learning process.
Having seen some of BAMS metals that seem to, well, push the edge of the envelope. What is your view on what's the edge of the envelope? In other words, how far do you go with shape, material, etc., before the metal is no longer a metal?
That's also a great question. At what point is it not a metal anymore? So I'm a member of the International Metal Group, FEDM. Maybe some of you are too. And this is an international group that has an exhibit every other year. For 2020, it was canceled because of the pandemic. So next year they plan to have that in Tokyo. Last year was in Ottawa, Canada. So this is a coming together of medalists from all over the world. And some of them are very, very modern, using unusual materials, shapes, depths. Some are struck, cast, fabricated, and all kinds of things. And some of them, I think, do cross the line into being little sculptures rather than metals. There's no hard and fast definition, as I'm sure you guys know. It doesn't have to be round. It doesn't have to be made of metal. It doesn't have to have two sides. But in my mind, it has to have at least some resemblance to a metal. If it's not made of metal, it should have two sides. If it's really deep, at least it should be round. So it has some connection. In that international community, they do accept things that I personally think are not metals anymore. But there's some gray area there for opinion.
Here's a question. I am curious about cast versus die struck. Do you approach these in a similar or in a different way?
Both. So a struck metal, like I was talking about earlier, there's a lot of consideration to die flow and the depths. And even though it's fun to make metals of different shapes, like the Brook green metal is a square, that's fun, but there's also a cost component to consider. It's more expensive to make a coin or a metal that's a different shape other than the standard size and being round. So that's a consideration. And the depth, there's very, very specific depths. So I have a caliper that I use, and within 3/1000ths of an inch, which is the thickness of a hair, is how exacting it is in the depths of doing a struck metal. Doing a cast metal, I have absolute freedom of depth. I don't have to consider that at all. But what I do have to consider is the techniques of the foundry. Most foundries are used to doing very large sculptures or medium-sized sculptures. But when doing a very small metal, any flaws show up very obviously. And so you have a less pristine surface. So I will add typically more texture into a piece that I know is going to be cast, so that any of that organic, natural flaws of the casting will go with the design instead of against it.
All right, with that, thank you all for attending with us, and we will see you at the next meeting. Thank you very much, Heidi. I appreciate it.
Thank you
all.